The day Lavinia Rhodes pressed seeds into ground so hard it rang like iron under her knuckles. She did not cry, though she had been crying for the better part of 4 months, and had begun to believe she might never stop. It was the third week of November in the year 1878, and the high plains of southeastern Colorado Territory held the cold like a jealous man holds a grudge tight and without apology. The sky above the Rhodes homestead was the color of old pewter, flat and featureless, and the wind came down off the mountains in long, shuddering waves that bent the dry grass flat and rattled the single window in the front wall of the soddy. Lavinia knelt in the small rectangle of earth she had turned the previous afternoon, working a broken-handled trowel with fingers she could no longer properly feel, and she pushed each seed down into the crack she made in the frozen crust with a kind of ceremony that bordered on desperate prayer. She was 31 years old. Her husband, Thomas Rhodes, had been dead since the first week of July, kicked in the chest by a mule named Dix who had kicked him once before and been given another chance because Thomas was a forgiving man, and also, truthfully, because mules were expensive. The kick had caved in 2 ribs, and one of those ribs had found something vital, and Thomas had lasted 3 days before going quiet on a blanket in the back of the soddy while Lavinia held his hand and their daughter, Clara, age 7, pressed her face against her mother's hip and did not understand what she was watching. After Thomas died, Lavinia had done what women in her position always did in those years. She had buried him. She had written to his brother in Missouri, who wrote back with condolences that were sincere but offered no help. She had inventoried what she had, which amounted to 1 soddy in middling repair, 40 acres of claim land that was half clay and half ambition, a milk cow named Augusta, 4 laying hens, a mule not Dix, who had been sold immediately, but a gentler animal called Pepper, and a chest of provisions that she estimated would carry her and Clara through the winter if she was very careful and did not get sick. What she did not have was enough saved money to plant a proper spring crop. What she did not have was a man to break the difficult ground or haul water from the creek, a quarter-mile away. What she did not have was any clear idea of what happened to a widowed woman in the Colorado Territory in 1878 if the spring planting failed. She knew the answers other women had found. Some had sold their claims. Some had gone back east to family that resented their return. Some had remarried quickly and practically, which was a kind of selling too, just a different transaction. Lavinia had spent 4 months rejecting all of those outcomes with a stubbornness that some neighbors called admirable and others called foolish. And now she was kneeling in frozen dirt in November, pressing turnip seeds and winter rye into ground that had no business receiving either of them. She had read in a farming almanac, one of 3 books she owned, the others being a Bible and a volume of Tennyson poems that had belonged to her mother, that winter rye could sometimes be planted in late autumn if the ground had not frozen entirely through, and that the seeds would lie dormant through the winter and rise in the earliest thaw. The almanac had been written by a man in Ohio who had never seen Colorado Territory, but Lavinia was choosing to trust him anyway because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing was the one thing she had decided she absolutely could not permit herself. She had also read that turnips were hardier than people gave them credit for. She pushed the last seed into the ground, covered it with her palm, pressed hard, and said aloud to no one, "Stay there." Oliver Bancroft saw her from the fence line. He was not spying. He had been riding the eastern edge of his property, which shared a long, irregular boundary with the Rhodes claim, checking on a section of cedar post fence that his hired man had reported was leaning badly after a steer had run through it in a panic during a lightning storm 2 weeks prior. He had repaired the fence. He was on his way back. And when he came up over the small rise that separated his land from the flat expanse of her claim, he had seen her there, a woman in a dark wool coat and a man's hat pulled low, kneeling in the dirt before the soddy with an intensity that made him pull his horse up without thinking. Oliver was 36 years old, a rancher who had come to Colorado Territory from Virginia 12 years before with $100, a good horse, and what he later described as a very poor understanding of how much work was involved. He had built the Bancroft spread to a respectable size, 1,200 acres, a proper wooden ranch house, a solid barn, 40 head of cattle, 4 good horses. Through a combination of relentless labor, good judgment about land and water, and the kind of quiet stubbornness that looked like patience from the outside. He had never married. He had come close once, a woman named Eleanor from Pueblo, but Eleanor had wanted a life that a ranch in the territorial high plains could not provide, and they had parted without malice and without resolution, which was its own kind of grief. Since then, Oliver had occupied himself with his land and his cattle, and a monthly supper at the Hutchinson family's home 2 miles north, which was as close as he came to social life. He had been aware of the Rhodes family since Thomas and Lavinia had filed on the adjacent claim 3 years before. He and Thomas had spoken maybe a dozen times about fence lines, about water rights to the creek that technically ran through both their properties, about the weather in the way that men on the plains talk about weather, which is to say constantly, and with the solemnity of men discussing theology. Thomas had been a good-natured man, steady, not particularly skilled at farming but willing to learn. Oliver had respected him. When Thomas died, Oliver had sent over a smoked ham and his condolences via his hired man, Ren Castillo, because he had thought a widow might not want an unmarried man showing up unannounced at her door in the days of fresh grief. He had seen Lavinia at the trading post in the small settlement of Harrow Creek 3 times since then, and they had exchanged the careful pleasantries of 2 people who know each other slightly and are both unsure of what is owed. Now he sat on his horse at the fence line and watched her press seeds into the frozen earth, and something happened in his chest that he could not immediately name. It was not pity. He had started to feel pity and then abandoned it because what she was doing did not invite pity. She was not weeping. She was not collapsing. She was pressing seeds into ground with a methodical deliberateness that reminded him of something. After a moment he placed it. It reminded him of a man he had known in his first years on the plains, an old trapper named Calhoun, who had continued to set his lines every morning for a full winter even after the beaver had mostly been trapped out of the territory, not because he expected much return, but because the act of doing the work was itself the point. Lavinia Rhodes was doing the work. In November, in frozen ground, because the act of doing the work was what stood between her and giving up. He sat with his horse a long moment. She did not look up. She did not know he was there. And then he said, quietly more to himself than to her, "That takes faith." The wind carried his voice down the rise and she heard it. She looked up sharply, one hand still pressed flat against the cold earth, and her eyes found him at the fence line, a tall man on a gray horse, backlit by the pale sky. And she could not read his expression from that distance, but she could hear in those 3 words something that was not mockery and not condescension, and not the particular brand of concerned pity she had been receiving from every person she had encountered for 4 months. She stood up. She pulled the man's hat down harder against the wind. Said, loudly enough to carry, "It takes something." Oliver Bancroft swung down off his horse without entirely deciding to do so, looped the reins around a fence post, stepped over the leaning section of his fence onto her side of the property line, and walked down the rise toward her. He was aware even as he did it that this was something he did not usually do. He did not walk onto other people's land uninvited. He did not insert himself into situations that were not his concern. He was not a forward man by nature. He stopped 6 feet from her, hat in hand, because it felt rude to keep it on. Up close she looked like she had not been sleeping well, which he already knew from seeing her in town and which was not a surprise given the circumstances. Her eyes were gray-brown, the color of creek water in overcast light, and they were watching him with a careful wariness that he thought he probably deserved. "Oliver Bancroft," he said. "I apologize for intruding. I was at the fence line on my side." "I know who you are," Lavinia said. She looked at the small patch of broken earth between them. "You're going to tell me winter rye won't take in ground like this. I wasn't going to tell you that. Most people would. Most people weren't riding past just now." She looked at him again. The wariness did not entirely leave her face, but something in it shifted. "What were you going to say?" "I've seen men plant in ground that looked worse than this and have it come up in March," Oliver said, which was true, though only barely. "I can't promise anything, but I wouldn't say it's foolish." Lavinia looked back at the small rectangle of disturbed earth. 4 rows of rye, 2 rows of turnips, pressed into ground that would freeze harder tonight and harder still the week after. She said, "I'm not entirely certain it isn't foolish." "No," Oliver said, "but foolish and faithful aren't always different things." She looked at him sharply again, and this time he saw something flicker across her face that was not wariness, something almost like relief, as though she had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that and had been afraid no one ever would. "My daughter is inside," Lavinia said. "She has her father's talent for appearing at inconvenient moments. I'm telling you so you're not startled." "I remember her from the trading post," Oliver said. "Clara. She traded Mr. Holt 2 chicken feathers for a piece of horehound candy, and he made the trade without blinking." The corner of Lavinia's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was related to one. "She's been experimenting with commerce. She drove a better bargain than most of the cowboys who come through Harrow Creek." This time, Lavinia did smile, briefly and with an evident effort, and Oliver thought it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time, and then immediately felt guilty for thinking so because her husband had been dead 4 months and she was kneeling in frozen dirt with bleeding knuckles, and it was not the moment for that kind of thought. He cleared his throat. "I have a load of winter fodder coming in from Pueblo next week," he said. "Excess, more than I can store. If you want I can send some over. It would keep your cow and your mule through the hard months without you having to stretch your supply." Lavinia looked at him with the careful measuring look he was beginning to understand was her primary mode of assessing the world. "That's a substantial offer for an inconvenient fence check. I ride this fence line every couple of weeks. I'd have offered before, but I wasn't certain of my welcome." She considered that. She looked at her frozen garden. She looked back at him. "I would be grateful," she said, with a dignity that made the words mean something very different from what they would have meant coming from someone less proud. "I'll send it with Wren," Oliver said. "My hired man. He's been out this way before." "I know Wren Castillo," Lavinia said. "He helped Thomas with the roof in the 2nd year. He's a good man. The best I've employed." There was a moment of wind, and then the front door of the soddy opened and Clara appeared, age 7, wearing a coat 3 sizes too large and the expression of someone who had been watching through the window and had made a decision about what she thought of all this. She walked directly across the frozen ground to her mother's side, examined Oliver with the frank appraisal unique to children of that age, and said, "You have a very big horse." "He's a quarter horse," Oliver said. "His name is Wallace." "Why Wallace?" "Because he came to me already named and it seemed rude to change it." Clara considered this with great seriousness. "Our mule is named Pepper," she offered. "We named him that ourselves. He doesn't have very good table manners. Most mules don't. Mama says patience is the only answer." "Your mama is correct about most things, I suspect." Clara looked up at her mother with the expression of a child who has formed an opinion and is waiting to see if it is shared. Lavinia put her hand on Clara's shoulder and said, "Mr. Bancroft was just leaving." "You can come back," Clara said to Oliver with the unself-conscious directness of children. "Mama made molasses bread yesterday." "Clara," Lavinia said quietly. "She did. It's good. I had 2 pieces." Oliver put his hat back on. He looked at Lavinia, who was looking at her daughter with an expression that was half exasperation and half the most transparent love he had ever seen on a human face. He said, "I'll send the fodder with Wren next week, Mrs. Rhodes." "Thank you, Mr. Bancroft," Lavinia said. He walked back up the rise, stepped over his fence, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the Bancroft spread. He did not look back, which cost him something. He rode for half a mile before he realized he was smiling. The fodder arrived on a Tuesday, hauled in Ren Castillo's wagon along with an unexpected addition: 2 burlap sacks that Ren presented to Lavinia with a slight air of rehearsed casualness that told her they had not been his idea. One contained potatoes. The other contained dried corn, the kind meant for grinding, and at the bottom of it, wrapped in paper, were 2 more packets of seeds, cold hardy onion sets, and a variety of winter wheat that the paper identified as coming from a seed company in Kansas. There was a note written in a plain hand: "These varieties are bred for the high plains. The onions will winter better than most." "Oh, Bancroft." Lavinia stood in the doorway of the soddy holding the seed packets for a long time. Ren Castillo pretended to be very busy with the wagon straps. She said, "Will you thank him for me, Ren?" "I'll do that," Ren said. "Tell him," she paused, "tell him I'll plant the onion sets tomorrow." Ren smiled a slow smile that communicated a number of things without stating any of them. "I'll tell him exactly that," he said. The winter came down hard in December, as it always did on the high plains of Colorado Territory. The temperature dropped to numbers that made the air feel like breathing in glass, and the creek froze solid a week before Christmas, and the snow came in quantities that turned the landscape into a featureless white expanse that could disorient a person badly enough to kill them if they had to walk any distance in a storm without landmarks. Lavinia had lived through 2 Colorado winters already and did not panic, but she felt the weight of it: the daily hauling of ice to melt for water, the constant tending of the stove, the careful rationing of wood and coal and food, the short days that ended at 4 in the afternoon and left endless hours of darkness in which the wind moaned around the sod walls and Clara slept in her cot, and Lavinia sat by the lamp and thought about things she would rather not think about. She thought about Thomas, or rather she thought about the absence of Thomas, which was its own specific geography, a space in the room shaped like a person, felt most acutely in the evening when he would have been sitting across from her with his pipe or reading aloud from the Bible in the slightly stumbling way he had, as though the words were always a little unfamiliar to him regardless of how many times he had read them. She grieved him honestly and without performance. She also, in moments that she did not share with anyone, grieved the life she had imagined they were building together, which had been modest enough but had been hers and now was not. She thought, in other moments, about a tall man on a gray horse saying that takes faith, and she pressed those thoughts down like seeds in cold ground and did not examine them too closely. Oliver came by in person for the first time in January, on a clear cold morning when the sky was the impossible deep blue that the Colorado sky became in winter when it was not snowing. He came riding up the track to the soddy with 2 things in his saddlebags: a haunch of venison and a book. He left the venison on the porch step without knocking, as he had planned, but then Clara opened the door before he could remount and said with the tone of someone who had caught a person in the act of something, "You could come in for coffee, you know." Lavinia appeared behind Clara wearing a look that suggested she had not been consulted about this invitation and was in 2 minds about it. But she stepped back from the door, which was itself a kind of invitation, and Oliver left Wallace tied to the porch rail and went in. The inside of the soddy was small and clean and warmer than he expected, with a good stove that Lavinia clearly managed with skill, and a low shelf of books that he found himself looking at immediately: the Bible, the Tennyson, and 3 or 4 others, everything arranged with the care of someone who did not have much and treated what she had with exactness. Clara's drawings were pinned to the wall near her cot, animals mostly, rendered in charcoal with an energy that made up for what it lacked in technical precision. He set the book on the table. It was a practical farming guide, detailed, published in 1876, that covered high-altitude growing conditions with a seriousness the Ohio Almanac had lacked. He said, "I thought this might be useful. It's mine to lend, not give. I'd want it back in the spring." Lavinia picked it up and read the title and flipped through the first pages with the focus of someone who reads seriously, not for show. "I'll take good care of it," she said. "I know you will." She made coffee on the stove, real coffee, which told him she was not rationing it yet, though the winter was only half over. Clara sat at the table across from Oliver and put her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands and watched him with the open curiosity of a child who has already decided a person is interesting and is now conducting research to determine why. "Do you have children?" Clara asked. "Clara," Lavinia said from the stove, "I'm asking." "I don't," Oliver said. "I'm not married." "Why not?" "Clara, that is not a polite question," Lavinia said firmly. "Mama asks it about everyone in town," Clara said with devastating honesty. Oliver did not allow himself to smile, though it required effort. "It's all right," he said. "I haven't found the right situation," he said, which was the best answer he could manage that was honest and appropriately simple for a 7-year-old. Clara turned this over. "Our neighbor Mrs. Holt says you're the best rancher in 40 miles and it's a waste that you eat supper alone." "Clara Josephine Rhodes," Lavinia said in a voice that suggested genuine mortification. "She said it. I'm reporting." Oliver looked at his coffee cup. He said, "Mrs. Holt is very kind." "She's also very loud," Clara said, "but Mama says that's different from being wrong." The coffee was very good. Oliver drank it and talked with Lavinia about the farming guide, about the varieties of winter wheat, about the condition of her seed store, and whether the onion sets had shown any signs of life under the frost layer. Lavinia talked about farming the way she did everything with a precision that told him she had been thinking hard about it, reading, forming opinions. She had questions that were not general questions but specific ones, about drainage and soil composition, and the way the low rises on her property might affect spring frost pocket formation. And Oliver found himself in a genuine conversation of the kind he had not had about farming with anyone in years, because most people he talked to about farming either knew more than he did or considerably less. When he left an hour later, Lavinia walked him to the door and said, without quite meeting his eyes, "I'm glad you came in." "So am I," he said, which was so much of an understatement that he felt slightly embarrassed by the inadequacy of it. He rode home across the white plain and thought about the way she talked about her seeds with an intensity that was almost fierce, as though the survival of those seeds was a matter of personal importance beyond the merely practical, which he supposed it was. He thought about Clara's drawings on the wall and Lavinia's careful shelf of books, and the good coffee, and the way the morning light had come through the single window and caught the side of Lavinia's face while she read the first pages of the farming guide. He thought, "I am in a great deal of trouble." He thought this with something that felt very much like gratitude. February was the cruelest month in that winter of 1878 going into 1879. A blizzard came through that lasted 4 days, and the snow depth on the open plain reached a man's chest in places, and the drifts against the soddy came up past the window. Lavinia and Clara spent 3 of those 4 days almost entirely inside, melting snow for water, eating from their stores, reading, playing the card games Clara had invented with rules that changed in her favor whenever she was losing. On the 4th day, Lavinia dug out the door and cleared a path to the small outbuilding where Augusta the cow and Pepper the mule were sheltering, and found them cold but alive, the fodder Oliver had sent still sustaining them. On the 5th day, when the sky cleared again to that impossible blue, Oliver came riding through the drifts on Wallace, who was a large enough horse to manage it, with 2 more things: a tool roll containing a new trowel with a sound handle, and a jar of preserved peaches that he said, a little awkwardly, he had traded for at the Hutchinson house because he thought Clara might like them. Clara did like them. She ate 3 peach slices standing up and then looked at Oliver with the expression of someone who has made a final assessment of a situation and is at peace with it. "You can sit in Papa's chair if you want," she said. Mama doesn't sit in it and it's just sitting there." The silence that followed this had a particular texture. Lavinia stood very still at the stove. Oliver looked at the chair, which was a good oak chair, slightly mended at one arm, positioned near the stove in a way that had clearly been habitual for the man who had lived here. He looked at Lavinia, who was looking at the wall. He said gently, "I'll sit here just fine," and pulled out the bench on the other side of the table. Clara climbed up on the bench beside him and offered him a peach slice, which he accepted, and the moment passed. But afterward, riding home, Oliver turned over what had just happened in his mind. Clara had offered him her father's chair. Clara, who drew animals on the wall and traded chicken feathers for candy and asked impolite questions with the confidence of someone who had never been told they were impolite. Clara had offered him the chair, and Lavinia had not corrected her. He did not know what that meant. He thought maybe it meant something. March came in brutal and then softened, the way Colorado March does, alternating between days that felt like genuine spring and days that drove you back inside with fresh blizzard conditions. Lavinia spent the first warm day of March crouched over her small garden plot with the farming guide open on the ground beside her, examining the frozen surface for signs of the life she had put there in November. She probed the soil carefully and found it deep frozen still, but when she broke the surface crust in one spot she was not certain but she thought, that the brown dead color of the soil gave way just slightly to something that might be almost green if you looked at it in the right light. She told Clara at supper that night that she believed the seeds were still alive in there. Clara said, "Did you tell Mr. Bancroft?" "I did not," Lavinia said. "You should tell him. He's been asking Wren to check on us after storms." Lavinia set down her spoon. "How do you know that?" "Wren told me when he came for the fodder bucket. He said Mr. Bancroft asked him to make sure we were all right after every big snow." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was kind of him." "Wren says he hasn't done that for anyone else," Clara said, with the expression of someone who is reporting information and not drawing conclusions, except that she was absolutely drawing conclusions. The next time Oliver rode past her fence line, which was on a Thursday morning in the second week of March, when the snow had pulled back enough to reveal the actual ground in long, brown, irregular patches, Lavinia was waiting at the fence. She had told herself she was there to check the fence post nearest the property line, which was true as far as it went. When Oliver came over the rise and saw her there, he pulled up and then came down the rise at a walk. "The rye is showing," she said before he could speak. "Just barely, the tips of it. You can see them if you know what you're looking for." He swung down from Wallace and came to the fence and looked where she was pointing, at the small brown rectangle of her garden where, yes, if you looked, if you were someone who knew what emerging winter rye looked like in its earliest stages, you could see the faintest thread of green-gray pushing through the frost-cracked earth. Oliver looked at it for a long time, then he looked at her. "The onion sets," he said. "Not yet, but they'll follow." "They'll follow," he agreed. She was standing close enough to the fence that they were only separated by the two cedar posts and the single strand of wire between them, and the morning light was doing something generous to her face, bringing out the warmth in skin that had gone pale through the winter. And Oliver Bancroft looked at Lavinia Rhodes standing at her fence in the Colorado March morning, pointing at the first green shoots of a crop she had planted in frozen ground in November, and felt something he had not permitted himself to feel clearly until this moment. He said, "I've been wanting to ask you something." "Ask it," she said, direct as always. "Would you let me take you to the Easter social at the Harrow Creek Church, you and Clara, as company? Not as anything that needs to be named right now if you don't want it to be, just as company." He watched her carefully. He watched her consider it. He watched her look at the green shoots in the frozen ground and then look at him, and he saw in her face the particular struggle of a woman who had decided to be careful and is now confronting the possibility that carefulness has limits. "Easter is 3 weeks away," she said. "It is." People will notice. People always notice, he said, and could not quite keep the frankness out of his voice. I think they've already noticed me riding this fence line rather more often than the fence requires. Something that was not quite a smile and was not quite a blush moved across her face. She said, I suspect they have. I won't press, he said. It's just a social. But I find myself wanting to sit across a table from you in a setting where Clara is occupied with other children, and I can talk to you without feeling like I'm taking advantage of a widow's hospitality in the middle of a hard winter. That landed somewhere in her. He could see it land. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, You haven't been taking advantage. I'm glad you think so. I think she stopped. She looked at her chutes again. Then she looked at him with a directness that he had come to understand was her truest self, the part of her that did not perform or prevaricate. I think I would like to go to the Easter social, as company, as you said. I'll come for you both at 9 on Easter morning, Oliver said. Clara will be very pleased with herself, Lavinia said. She has good instincts, Oliver said. Lavinia laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded, the first real laugh he had heard from her. And it was brief and a little rough from disuse, like something that had been stored in a cold room through the winter. But it was genuine and it was his, and he carried it home across the browning, snow-patched plain like a man carrying something that might break if handled carelessly. The Easter social at the Harrow Creek Community Church was held on the 6th of April, 1879, on a day of such crystalline spring beauty that it seemed almost pointed, as though the Colorado sky were making an argument. The church was small, 30 people would have been a crowd in it, and so the social happened outside in the yard, with tables set up on sawhorses and covered in oilcloth. And the women of the congregation had been cooking for 2 days, and it showed. There was ham and corn bread and dried apple pie, and a punch made from creek water and canned fruit, and 1 or 2 things that tasted like they had been through a still at some point, though Reverend Marsh pretended not to notice. Lavinia came to it in the best dress she had brought to Colorado territory, a dark blue wool with a white collar that she had let out at the sleeves and taken in at the waist since Thomas died, because grief had done what grief always does to a body. And her hair was up properly for the first time in what she suspected was months. And Clara was wearing her Sunday dress, and had her own hair in plaits that had required the better part of an hour that morning. Oliver had arrived at 9 exactly, as he had said, in his good coat and a clean shirt and his best hat, which Lavinia clocked immediately as an effort that matched her own, and had driven them in his wagon, which was infinitely more dignified than Pepper the mule could have managed. He had given Clara the front seat of the wagon and himself and Lavinia the bench, and on the drive over Clara had talked without pausing about the green shoots and the onion sets and whether chickens had emotions, and Oliver had engaged with all of it with a patient attention that Lavinia watched and felt something about that she was not ready to put into words. At the social, they were noticed. Of course they were noticed. This was a settlement of 50 families spread over 20 miles of plain, and everyone knew everything about everyone within a range of error of about 24 hours. Mrs. Hutchinson, who was Lavinia's nearest neighbor to the north, and a woman of inexhaustible goodwill and commentary, came and pressed both their hands and said how nice this was without specifying what this referred to, but her face specified it clearly enough. The men who knew Oliver acknowledged him with the particular nod that men on the frontier use for most of their social communication. A few younger women from the settlement who had been watching the Bancroft property for years with the interest of people watching an unclaimed resource found things to do in other parts of the yard. Oliver brought Lavinia a plate of food and then stood beside her while they ate, talking, and this time without a fence between them, and without the shelter of her sati to make the situation about hospitality rather than what it actually was. They talked about things that mattered. The grant of statehood question. Colorado had become a state in 1876, and the question of what the federal land policies would mean for small claimants was something both of them had been watching: the drought conditions of the previous decade, and whether the soil science was improving to the point where dryland farming could become genuinely sustainable in the territory. The Ute Treaty situation, which Oliver spoke about with a bluntness that surprised Lavinia. He said flatly that the territory's treatment of the Ute people was an injustice that would compound over time, and that the pressure to remove them from their lands in the southwestern part of the territory was driven by interests that had nothing to do with law or fairness. And Lavinia looked at him with a respect that shifted the calculus of what she was feeling by a noticeable degree. She said, "Most men out here won't say that plainly. Most men out here benefit from not saying it," Oliver said. "That doesn't make the thing less true." "No," Lavinia said, "it doesn't." Clara came running back from the children's egg hunt with a basket containing 6 eggs, which she presented to her mother as evidence of something, then looked at Oliver and Lavinia standing close together at the edge of the table and said, "Oh, good," in a tone of complete satisfaction, and ran off again. Oliver watched her go. "She's remarkable," he said. "She's 7, Lavinia said. "She has no sense of subtlety yet. I'm grateful for that." Lavinia looked at him sideways, assessing, and he held her gaze, and the spring air between them held very still for a moment, like the second before a bird takes flight. And then Clara came back with a question about whether chickens could eat hard-boiled eggs, and the moment passed into the next moment, which was also good. On the drive home, with Clara asleep in the front of the wagon before they had gone 2 miles, lulled by the motion and the warm afternoon sun, Oliver and Lavinia sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The plain stretched out golden and brown and beginning green around them, the mountains to the west catching the late light, and the sky above holding the last of the afternoon blue. Lavinia said, "I want to say something." "Say it," he said, echoing her own phrasing back to her without thinking, and she noticed, and her expression shifted. "I have been very careful," she said. "Since Thomas died, I have been careful about everything. About money and food and wood, and about not asking anyone for help I couldn't repay, and about not," she paused, "about not feeling things too quickly." "That sounds sensible," Oliver said carefully. "It was necessary," she said. "But I want you to know that I am aware that you have been very kind, and that it has not been. I want you to know that it hasn't gone unnoticed or unfelt, even when I was being careful." Oliver was quiet for a moment, watching the road, listening to the horse's steady gait and the sleeping breath of her daughter in the front seat. Then he said, "I didn't do any of it to earn anything. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "That's part of why it meant what it did." He looked at her then, turning from the road for a moment, and what was in his face was not performed and not restrained, and she saw it clearly and did not look away. "I'm not going to rush anything," he said. "I don't want you to think that that any of this has been calculated toward a particular outcome by a particular date. You've had a hard year, and it is not yet fully over, and I'm not a man who forgets those things." "Oliver," she said, and his name in her voice was different from how she had said it before, which had always carried a slight formality. Now it was just his name. "I planted seeds in frozen ground in November because I needed something to believe in. And you were the only person who looked at that and said it made sense." He said nothing. What was there to say to that? The wagon rolled on, and Clara slept, and the mountains turned from gold to purple in the descending evening, and they sat beside each other in the warm silence of 2 people who have found each other without quite meaning to, and are only now beginning to understand what that means. The spring unfolded in stages, the way it always does on the high plains, reluctant, and then sudden, and then overwhelming. April brought mud, and then green, and then the first real warmth, and Lavinia's winter rye came up with a persistence that she found personally satisfying. 4 inches by the middle of April, dark green against the pale brown of the surrounding earth. The onion sets had followed in late March, small but definite, pushing up through the thawed soil with the resolute indifference to adversity that onions have always had. She stood over them in the mornings before Clara was up, and felt something in her chest that she had almost forgotten the name of, which was hope. Oliver came every week now, sometimes twice. He came without pretense. There was always a reason, fodder to check, a question about the property line, something Wren had brought by and needed signing for, but they both understood that the reasons were incidental and the visits were the point. He would come in for coffee, and sometimes for supper if it was late enough in the day that leaving seemed more disruptive than staying. And Clara had stopped even pretending that there was anything unusual about this arrangement. She showed Oliver her drawings and reported on the garden, and asked him questions about cattle and horses and the geography of Virginia, which he answered with a thoroughness that suggested he enjoyed being asked. In May, Lavinia asked him to help her break the additional acre of ground she had been planning to plant in summer crops: corn, beans, squash, the sustaining crops that she needed to get through the next winter with her stores intact and something left over to sell. She asked directly and practically, as a neighbor asking a neighbor for labor assistance, but she brought it to him in person on a morning when she had walked the half-mile to the Bancroft fence line for the specific purpose of asking him. And when he said yes immediately, and without a single qualification, she said thank you in a voice that carried more weight than 2 words should carry, and he heard it all. They broke the new ground together over 3 days. At the end of May, Oliver with his larger plow and his good horses, Lavinia beside him, guiding and adjusting, learning the way the ground behaved in this corner of her claim that she had not planted before. Wren Castillo came on the 2nd day to help with the turning, and arrived to find Oliver and Lavinia working side by side with a focused ease that told him what he needed to know. And he went about his work without comment, except for a small private smile he directed at no one in particular. On the 3rd evening, when the acre was fully turned and the light was going golden and long across the raw earth, Lavinia looked at what they had done and said, "I couldn't have managed this alone, not this spring." Oliver was cleaning the plow blades, his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled. He looked at her from under the brim of his hat. "You'd have managed something. I'd have managed less. Maybe, but you'd have managed." She walked over to where he was working and she stopped close to him, closer than she would have stood in November or even March, and she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask it," he said, and his voice had a quality in it that told her he had been waiting. "I don't want to be careful anymore," she said. "About this, about you. I've been thinking about it since Easter, and I think being careful stopped being the right thing some time ago, and I've been doing it anyway out of habit or out of, I don't know, out of some idea that grief has a mandatory duration." Oliver set down the cloth he had been cleaning with. He looked at her with an attention that she felt all the way through. "It doesn't," he said quietly. "No," she said. "It doesn't. Thomas was a good man, and I loved him, and I will not stop loving the memory of him. But he is gone, and I am here, and you are here, and I find—" Her voice did something unexpected, and she steadied it. "I find that I think about you every day, and that this acre of turned earth is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen because you helped me make it, and I think—" He closed the distance between them, and she stopped talking, and he took her hands in his, still rough and dirty from the work, and she looked down at their joined hands with an expression that he thought was the most open thing he had ever seen on a human face, and then she looked up at him. He said, "Lavinia." She said, "Yes." He kissed her there in the turned earth in the golden evening light, with the smell of fresh soil and spring air around them, and it was not a hesitant kiss or a polite one. It was the kiss of 2 people who have been patient for a long time and are now, finally, not being patient, and she kissed him back with an honesty that matched the rest of her, complete and unguarded and sure. When they stepped apart, not far at all, she said, "I still owe you a farming almanac." He laughed, which was the best sound she had heard in a year. "You do? I'm not in a hurry. I'm planting corn next week," she said. "I'll need help with the furrows." "I'll be here," he said. "Good," she said, and the words settled between them like something planted, a thing with roots already forming. The summer of 1879 was the summer Lavinia Rhodes's claim became a real farm. Not a prosperous farm. Not yet. The land still had the particular stubbornness of high plains soil that has to be convinced before it will produce. And the water situation required careful management. And there were 3 weeks in July when the heat came down like a lid. And she watered everything by hand from barrels she and Oliver had rigged from the creek with an arrangement of buckets and rope that Wren described as either ingenious or insane depending on the day. But the corn came up. The beans came up. The squash spread across the eastern end of the new acre with a vigor that was almost alarming. And in the original garden plot, her winter rye had grown and been cut and dried, and she had ground a portion of it herself. And the onion sets had swelled into proper onions, and she stood in August in the middle of what she had grown from seeds pressed into frozen ground in November, and felt something that she had not expected to feel: vindication. Oliver was there when she took stock of the harvest in August. He came most evenings now, sometimes staying for supper, sometimes just for an hour as the light went down, and the situation between them had the warmth and ease of something that has been growing steadily and is no longer uncertain about what it is. They sat on the porch of the soddy in the August evening, which Lavinia had built up over the spring with boards Oliver had helped her haul from Harrow Creek, and looked at the farm in the evening light. "Next year," Lavinia said, "I want to expand the kitchen garden, and I think the drainage in the northwest corner of the claim could be improved if we redirected the small channel that comes off the creek. There's a natural grade there that—" "Lavinia," Oliver said. "Yes. Will you marry me?" She was quiet for 3 full seconds, which he counted. Then she said, "I've been waiting for you to ask." "How long?" "Since the Easter social," she said. "Clara asked me in April if I was going to marry Mr. Bancroft, and I said I didn't know, and she said you would ask eventually, and I should say yes. She's 7 years old." "She has very good instincts," Lavinia said, and turned to look at him with the full open directness of her gray-brown eyes, and he saw in them not a woman who was settling for a practical arrangement or a woman who was marrying again out of necessity, but a woman who had made a free and deliberate choice with both eyes open and her whole heart behind it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Oliver Bancroft." He took her hand. She looked at their joined hands the way she had looked at them the first time in the turned earth in May, and then she looked up at the farm she had made from nothing, from faith and frozen ground and seeds that had no reason to survive except that she had believed they would, and she smiled the real smile, the one that had come back to her slowly through the spring and summer and was now fully present and fully hers. "I'll need to talk to Clara," she said. "I already asked her," Oliver said. Lavinia stared at him. "You asked my 7-year-old daughter before you asked me." "I wanted to make sure of my welcome," he said, and his voice was perfectly straight, and she laughed and shoved him with her shoulder, and he caught her hand and held it, and the evening light came down warm and gold across the farm in Colorado territory, and the late summer corn stood tall in the field, and it was, in the specific way that real things are beautiful, very beautiful. They were married in October of 1879 at the Harrow Creek Community Church, in the same building where they had attended the Easter social, with Reverend Marsh officiating and approximately 40 people in attendance, which was more or less everyone within 20 miles who could make it on a Saturday. Mrs. Hutchinson cried. Wren Castillo was Oliver's witness, standing at the front of the church with the expression of a man who has been quietly waiting for a thing to happen for the better part of a year, and is pleased to see it confirmed in a formal and irrevocable way. Clara was the flower girl, which she treated as a professional responsibility, walking down the aisle with a concentration appropriate to a surgical procedure, scattering dried wildflower petals in precise patterns that apparently followed a logic only she understood. Lavinia wore the same dark blue wool dress from Easter, which was the best dress she had, but she had taken it to Mrs. Hutchinson, who had added a length of cream-colored lace at the collar that made it something different, something for this occasion, and she walked down the aisle of the small church toward Oliver Bancroft, who was standing at the front of it in his good coat with a look on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. the look of a man seeing something he had not permitted himself to entirely believe in until this moment suddenly being real. And she thought, I planted seeds in frozen ground and they grew. She thought, this is what they grew into. The ceremony was short and plain and correct, the words of it worn smooth by repetition into something that meant more than it seemed like it should. And when Reverend Marsh said the important words and they said theirs back to him, Lavinia felt the moment settle into her like something finding its level. Not the end of grief. She did not expect that, and she would not have wanted a love that demanded it, but the beginning of something new, built on the foundation of everything that had come before, including the hard parts, including the frozen ground and the lost winter and the seeds pressed into clay by bleeding hands. Oliver kissed her in front of 40 people, and Clara said, finally, in a very audible whisper that generated considerable laughter and a look from her new stepfather that was entirely undermined by the fact that he was smiling too hard to make it convincing. They held the wedding supper at the Hutchinson house because it was larger, and there was music. A fiddle player named Garrett who came from 20 miles off and who played everything from hymns to reels with equal competence, and dancing on the wooden floors, and food that half the settlement had contributed to. And Lavinia danced with Oliver, and then with Wren, and then with old Mr. Hutchinson, who was 72 and still had all his steps, and Clara danced with everyone who would have her and some who hadn't expected to be asked. Late in the evening, when the celebration was winding down and Clara was asleep in the corner of the Hutchinsons' back room on a pile of coats, Oliver found Lavinia at the edge of the room and held out his hand, and she took it, and they went outside into the October night where the stars above the Colorado plain were laid out in their vast abundance, and the air was cold and clean and smelled of winter coming. He put his arm around her against the cold and she leaned into him and they stood looking up at the stars in the particular silence of people who do not need to fill it. She said, I need to talk to you about the farm. He said, now, we're going to be living together starting tomorrow. I want to be clear about some things before that happens. He said, all right. The claim is mine, she said. I'm not giving it up. I know you have 1,200 acres and I have 40, and by any practical measure they should probably be joined, but I want to file the 40 as my property in my name, maintained as mine. It's not that I don't trust you. It's that I worked for it. He said without hesitation, of course. She looked at him. Most men would object. I'm not most men, he said, not with arrogance, just as a statement of fact. And you're not most women. Your 40 acres are yours. We'll work the land together, but the deed stays in your name. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been practicing that speech since August. Was that the whole speech? That was the whole speech. You can practice less, he said. I'm unlikely to require speeches. She turned to look at him in the starlight, this man she had married, who had come over her fence line on a November morning and said 3 words that had changed the direction of everything, and she felt an uncomplicated gladness that she had not expected to feel again. She said, Take me home, Oliver. Yes, ma'am, he said, and she laughed at the formality of it, and they went inside to collect their daughter and their coats and drove home under the October stars to the Bancroft spread, her home now, and Clara's home, the wide wooden ranch house that was warm and solid and larger than she had been used to, but which she had already begun to imagine as the place where her life would be lived. They settled into a life together that was, like all real lives, made of ordinary days with remarkable moments distributed through them at irregular intervals. The 2 properties were worked in close coordination, if not legal combination. Oliver's larger operation providing the infrastructure and capital that Lavinia's claim had always lacked, and Lavinia's focused intensity and knowledge of her particular plot of ground bringing a productivity to those 40 acres that they had never had under previous management. She planted her fields every spring with a thoroughness that made Oliver's hired men look at her with respect, and she kept her own accounts and managed her own yields, and contributed to the household in ways that were concrete and visible, which mattered to her more than he initially fully understood, and which he came to understand completely over time. Clara adapted to the Bancroft ranch with the confidence of a child who has always believed the world will rearrange itself to accommodate her best interests. She acquired a horse in the spring of 1880, a small pinto that Oliver selected with care and brought home with a ceremony that she received with the gravity of someone accepting an important commission, and she named the horse Plum, which she said was because of the color, though the horse was not especially plum-colored. She started at the school that had opened in Harrow Creek the previous fall and was, according to her teacher Miss Adler, both the most challenging and the most rewarding student she had. Oliver and Clara built a relationship that was its own thing, different from parent and child, and different from mere friendship, a particular warm rapport between a man who had never had children and a child who had lost her father and was negotiating what it meant to have a new one. Oliver did not try to replace Thomas. He was not that kind of man, and Clara would not have permitted it anyway. He was simply himself, patient and reliable and genuinely interested in what she thought about things, and over the months and years, this built into something that Clara eventually named herself. On a morning when she was 8 years old and Oliver had spent 45 minutes helping her understand why her arithmetic homework was wrong, by saying, "You're like a second father but different," and Oliver had said, "I'll take that." And that had been the end of the discussion and the beginning of the arrangement. In the spring of 1880, Lavinia found herself expecting their first child together. She told Oliver on a morning in April when the garden was coming up, and the farm was in the full flush of its first genuine productive season, standing in the kitchen of the ranch house with the spring light through the window, and his face did something that she had not quite seen it do before, a pure, uncomplicated joy without any of the reserved, careful quality that was usually there. And he came around the table and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solidity of him and thought, "I did not know it could be this." Their son was born in November of 1880, in the same month that Lavinia had pressed seeds into frozen ground 2 years before, which she found meaningful and Oliver said was a remarkable coincidence, and which Wren said with a slight smile was probably not a coincidence at all but a woman's good sense of timing. They named him Thomas Oliver Bancroft, the first name for Lavinia's first husband, which Oliver had suggested without prompting, and which settled something in Lavinia that had been waiting to be settled. Thomas Oliver had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined jaw, and from his first weeks displayed an intensity of focus that suggested he had inherited both his parents' stubbornness and concentration, which was either going to make him exceptional or very difficult to manage, possibly both. Clara received her brother with the air of someone who has been informed of a new project and has already begun planning her approach to it. She was 9 years old and took the business of being an older sister with a seriousness that made Lavinia laugh daily. She taught Thomas Oliver Tommy, as he became, to walk by the method of standing 6 feet away and holding out something interesting, which Oliver pointed out was exactly how you trained a horse, and which Clara said was a technique that worked on most creatures and was not an insult. The years that followed were good years, built in the way that good years are built on the frontier, through work and weather, and the incremental accumulation of what you have made. Oliver expanded the cattle operation carefully, not recklessly, watching the markets and the grazing conditions with the same patience he had always brought to the land. Lavinia's 40 acres became genuinely productive, well above what she could have achieved alone, and she used the proceeds to buy more seed varieties and a second milk cow, and eventually a small commercial arrangement with the trading post in Harrow Creek to supply dried vegetables through the winter months, which became a reliable and meaningful income. In the spring of 1882, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Ruth, who was born in April in the best possible spring weather, loud and healthy, and with a head of copper-red hair that came from somewhere in Lavinia's family history, and that the entire settlement commented on when they brought her to church for the first time. Ruth had her mother's coloring and her father's quiet watching quality, and from early on it was clear that she was the observer of the family, the one who sat and processed before acting, whereas Tommy had already demonstrated a tendency to act approximately 3 seconds before any observation had taken place. Their third child, another son, they named James, and he came in the winter of 1884, during a blizzard that was bad enough that Oliver had been genuinely worried for the first time since their marriage, and which Lavinia managed with a composure that he later said was either extremely impressive or extremely alarming, and was probably both. James was the biggest of the three and the most cheerful, a child who seemed to have been born with a disposition toward contentment that none of his siblings had quite inherited in the same degree, and which Lavinia said privately to Oliver was a gift from a generous universe. On the morning after James was born, when the blizzard had blown itself out and the world was deep in white and quiet and James was asleep in his cradle, and the older children were at the Hutchinson house where they had been sent for safety the day before, Oliver sat in the bedroom of the ranch house with Lavinia, who was tired in the complete way that new mothers are tired, and held her hand and said nothing for a long time. She said, "Do you remember what you said when you saw me at the fence line?" "That takes faith," he said. That was it. She looked at the cradle, at James, at the snow-covered window, at the room that was her room and his room and their life. "I've been thinking about it since, about whether what I was doing was really faith or whether it was something less, whether it was just stubbornness, which I have in quantity." "I think they're related," Oliver said. "I think faith is stubbornness aimed at something you believe in." She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the window, thin and white with the reflection of snow, and it made the room look like the inside of a cloud, soft and undifferentiated. She said, "I believe in this." "In case that needs saying." "It doesn't need saying," he said, "but I'm very glad you said it." She closed her eyes. He kept her hand. Outside, the snow lay over everything, over the farm and the 40 acres with their dormant fields waiting for spring, over the Bancroft ranch and its solid house and barn, and the good horses in their stalls, over the frozen creek and the fence line where two people had stood in November 2 years before and found each other without planning to. The land was sleeping under its winter covering, as it always did, as it always would, holding in the cold dark all the things that were coming, the onion sets and the winter wheat, the spring calves and the summer corn, the future in its patient and unstoppable form. James breathed in his cradle. Oliver held Lavinia's hand. In the front room of the house, Clara's drawings were still on the wall, a record of growth, and the shelf of books had grown considerably. The Bible, the Tennyson, the farming guide that had come back from Lavinia and been returned to its place on the Bancroft shelf, where it did not belong to either of them specifically, and therefore belonged to both, and a dozen other volumes acquired over the years from the lending library that had opened in Harrow Creek in 1881. The Hutchinson family's almanac was there too, and 2 years' worth of the Colorado agricultural surveys, and a collection of Clara's school reader that she had outgrown, and one very well-worn copy of Robinson Crusoe that Tommy had already claimed as his and would not share without negotiation. In the late afternoon, when Oliver had gone to feed the cattle and check the barn, and the older children had come back from the Hutchinsons full of energy and stories, Lavinia nursed James in the bedroom quiet, while Clara sat on the end of the bed and described in complete detail everything that had happened at the Hutchinson house in the preceding 24 hours, which was considerable, and Tommy rolled around on the bedroom floor in the way that 3-year-old boys roll around on floors, which is to say without clear purpose but with tremendous commitment. Clara said, pausing in her account to look at her brother in the cradle, "He looks like Papa." Lavinia looked at James. "A little," she said. "Which papa?" Tommy said from the floor, because at 3 he had absorbed the family's somewhat unusual configuration of histories without confusion or particular concern. "Both of them, maybe," Clara said with the confidence of someone who has thought about this already. "He has your papa's chin." "My papa died," Tommy said, not sadly, because he was 3 and had never known Thomas Rhodes, but as a statement of fact that he had been given and accepted. "He did," Clara said. "He was a good man, Mama's told me." "Oliver is a good man too," Tommy said. "Yes," Clara said, "we're very lucky." Lavinia looked at her children in the failing afternoon light of the January day. Clara, 11 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's serious examining quality, growing into a person of remarkable intelligence and character. Tommy, sturdy and focused, and already showing the signs of the man he would become. And James, brand new, beginning, a whole life ahead of him as yet uncomplicated by anything. And Oliver outside in the cold tending to the cattle, with the reliability that had been his defining quality since the first morning she had seen him at the fence line. A man who showed up and kept showing up, who had watched her press seeds into frozen ground and said that takes faith, and had then spent years proving that faith was not something you proclaimed but something you enacted, in small, consistent, daily acts of showing up. She thought, "I did not expect this. I did not know this was possible." She thought Thomas would have been glad for me. She thought, "I am glad for me." Spring came as it always did, as it always would. The snow pulled back in March, and the ground softened, and Lavinia was out in her 40 acres with her trowel and her seeds before the last frost date that any reasonable almanac would have recommended, because she had always been a woman who pushed the boundary of what the ground would accept, and the ground had always, eventually, accepted it. Oliver rode past the fence line on a morning in late March, not checking the fence. The fence was fine. The fence had been fine for years, and watched her working the ground in the early light, Clara beside her now and old enough to be genuinely useful, the two of them moving through the rows with the practiced ease of people who have done this together many times. He stopped his horse at the fence line. The morning was cold and clear, and the mountains to the west were still white, and the plain was the yellow-brown of early spring, the color of things about to begin. He watched Lavinia Rhodes, his wife, mother of his children, farmer of her 40 acres, press seeds into the ground with the same focused ceremony he had first seen 2 years and a lifetime ago in November, when she had been kneeling alone in frozen earth with bleeding knuckles and a quiet, desperate faith that had turned out to be justified in ways neither of them had yet imagined. She looked up and saw him. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked to the fence. Clara waved at her stepfather and went back to the rows. Lavinia said, "You're going to tell me it's too early for corn." "I wasn't going to tell you that," Oliver said. "Most people would." "Most people," he said, and the warmth in it was something she felt as a physical thing, "have not been watching you for the better part of 3 years. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on the fence post, her fingers still cold from the soil, and he wrapped his around them, warming them. The morning light was doing what Colorado morning light does in March, making everything look more possible than it had any right to look. She said, "Come down from that horse and help me with the furrows." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and dismounted. The spring planting went on. Clara worked beside her mother with her father beside them both, and in the house behind them Tommy was beginning to wake up, and James would be hungry soon, and the cattle needed moving to the south pasture, and there were 40 acres waiting to receive what they had to give, and the mountain stood over everything, permanent and indifferent in the most benevolent way, bearing witness to a life that had been built in the particular manner of things grown in difficult ground slowly, stubbornly, with faith and with patience, and with the specific grace of people who have found in each other something worth the growing. There was no grand conclusion, no final dramatic gesture. There was simply the farm on the Colorado plain in the year 1885, the fields coming up green in the spring air, a woman and a man and their children working the ground that had been frozen once and had thawed and had grown, that was always frozen and always thawing, that was the same ground that it had always been and was, because of what had been pressed into it with faith in the hardest season, different entirely. The onions would come up in June, same as always. The corn would need watching in July. The cattle would need moving before the August heat. The creek would run high in the spring thaw and low in August, and the fence between the properties would need checking twice a year, and the barn roof had a section that would need replacing before next winter, and Tommy had left his school reader in the barn again, which needed to be addressed. Lavinia pressed the last of the corn seeds into the ready earth and sat back on her heels, and looked at the row she had made with her husband's help straight and true and full of possibility, and felt, in the precise and ordinary warmth of the morning, exactly what she had felt pressing seeds alone into frozen ground in November. That this was the work, and the work was worth doing, and whatever grew from it would be real. She looked at Oliver, who was already moving to the next row, coat off, hat tilted against the morning sun, looking the way he always looked, like a man who is exactly where he intends to be, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that takes faith. And she had it. She had always had it. She just hadn't known yet what it would grow into. Ruth ran out of the house in her nightgown to tell them that Tommy had gotten into the honey jar and James was laughing about it. And Oliver looked at Lavinia, and Lavinia looked at Oliver, and Clara said from the row beside them, without looking up from her work, "I told him not to." And the morning went on as mornings do, full and specific and entirely theirs.